to do a little talk about utility. Just going to kind of do a basic introduction to what utility is and some ideas, some examples, kind of give you an idea of what utility is and if it's useful or if it's not useful. It's really, I guess that's usefulness is subject to the individual. So utility, when we're talking about utility, we're talking about consumer behavior basically. So what is utility, first of all? In economics, well, what is utility? It could be electricity, gas, things like that. Those are utilities. In economics, though, utility, it's just a term we use to define satisfaction or pleasure derived by the consumption of a good or a service. So, derived by a person from the consumption of a good or a service, or from being in a particular place and from the maximization of which all economic actions are motivated. So there are assumptions about human behavior. People are rational, which is people, when they act, they intend to make themselves better off. We assume people don't act with the intent of harming themselves. The outcome of the actions, on the other hand, that's immaterial as to how people act. We have buyer's remorse and things like that. People buy something and then within a few minutes they're remorseful, like, oh shoot. And sometimes you can take it back, right? But people make actions, people take actions that you look at them and you say, wow, that was pretty foolish. But at the time, the person thought it was an intelligent action. People bought Enron stock thinking it was a genius. People gave money to Madoff thinking they were geniuses, but nobody intended to lose their money, right? So, and also no in a particular place. So having, let's say, a hamburger or having a glass of wine is a good example. Having a glass of wine in one location and having it in another location, you're not going to derive the same amount of utility because part of the utility you consume from that glass of wine is the surroundings. So here, I'm in Seattle. We have the Space Needle here. Consuming a glass of wine in the Space Needle would not be the same as consuming a glass of wine at your dinner table. You derive a lot of utility from the glass of wine at the Space Needle, or at any restaurant, really, with friends around. I mean, that's why don't you just buy a bottle of wine for $10 and drink it at home versus buying a single glass of wine for probably $10 at the Space Needle? Well, it's because you derive a lot more utility from consuming that glass of wine. You derive a lot more satisfaction and pleasure from the consumption of the wine in a beautiful location with a view, and the restaurant turns as you go. So I think half an hour you've seen the whole city. So it's subjective is another thing. So utility is subjective to the individual. That's another very important aspect. We'll get to that in a little bit. Or the psychic return, from which cannot be measured in absolute or objective terms. It's being subjective. Goods or services that have utility for one person may not have them for another. I mentioned the wine. I get negative utility. Like, I am worse off from consuming wine because I just don't like wine. I don't drink at all. So, any kind of consumption of alcohol is a negative for me. I'd rather go have some tea or decaf coffee if it's the evening, right? So this is where we get kind of the idea of utility theory. So the question is, when we're talking about this, why do people work? Why do people work? Is it because they get money? But why do people try to accumulate a lot of wealth? Do they get a lot of utility from the wealth? Well, in a way, I guess some people get utility from knowing that the money is there. They get a bit of safety, and that makes them feel more satisfied, better. But there are no Scrooge McDucks, right? Nobody swims in their money. Nobody gets utility from merely having a fat stack of cash, the money in itself. Utility comes from the things that money can buy you. It's kind of the old saying, money can't buy you happiness, but money can buy you things that make you happy, right? And we know that that is true, right? At least in most cases, right? So the goal of the individual is utility maximization. We are humans and we're trying to make ourselves as happy as possible. And we do that by buying things that we prefer. And in a little bit, sometime later in the class, we'll get into the kind of deeper into that is we want to maximize utility subject to a budget constraint. What does that mean? We'll get into marginal utility, law of diminishing marginal utility. Utility, marginal utility, I'll get to that in a minute as well. Very important distinctions there. But the basic goal of humans, of people, us, you, me, is to maximize our satisfaction in life, if you will, given the scarce resources that are available to us. That is, in terms of utility, scarce resources are basically money, the amount of money that we have at our disposal, right? So one thing to note is consumer behavior, it's kind of quirky. We assume consumer preferences don't change over time, but we know for a fact they do. When I was a kid, I didn't like veggies. In fact, I used to scrape the sauce off the pizza and eat just the crust and the cheese with meat, pepperoni or something. Now, I would probably rather scrape the sauce off and just eat the sauce. Or I have the veggies, the things I used to take off the pizza, now that's all I really want. Right? I'll take the cheese off and I'll eat the veggies and the sauce. And I'm really into vegetables, stuff that I was not into as a kid. Veggie to me was carrots, and that was about it. Right? So they do change over time. And the utility we derive from different items changes as well. So some assumptions we have: utility does not mean usefulness. Not everything we derive utility from is what we would consider useful. Paintings, what can you do with it? It just sits there, right? But people derive a lot of utility. That's why they pay $400 million for Picasso. Classic cars, people will pay. I saw a GT40 for $7.25 million in Mecum auctions. What are they going to do with that? They're not going to drive it around town. They're not going to drive it to work, right? They get it from just having it and looking at it. It's subjective. We have the subjective theory of value. There's a hyperlink there. You can check it out later. I'll show that video in a little bit. Nothing is more subjective than tastes and preferences, right? I mean, really, look at your neighbor and you guys talk about music. They're going to have a variety of different types of music people like. I like country. A lot of people don't, right? So there's tastes and preferences are very different. So here's an example: of Prius in an urban setting versus a rural setting, right? I'm in Seattle, so Prius, they sell like crazy, but I go to the other side of the state and hardly anybody has. They have big trucks, right? Well, not a lot of those around here. Another thing is it's impossible to quantify, right? So we have rational behavior. I've got a link there as well. Kind of talks about what that is. I'll show that later. Again, maximize utility given the amount of money. So we have a set amount of money. We want to try to maximize the utility per. And really, when we get into a little bit, we'll talk about marginal utility per dollar, but not now. So the various preferences. We assume consumers know their preferences. They know their budget. The budget constraint. People know how much money they have. They know that their utility maximization is subject to that. That people know prices, and that the suppliers and the demanders, the consumers, all know the prices, and that they are not able to price discriminate, if you remember what that is. Products consumed are homogeneous, so one soda is like another soda, right? Coke is the same as, the first Coke, second Coke, third, it's all the same product, right? And the individuals decide on the margin. This is what we call thinking on the margin. There's another hyperlink there. I'll show that video in a little bit when we get more into that. And I just kind of want to get into some examples here. So I've got a link here. It's a great one. Shows the tipping. Why do you tip? Right? So in this link, George Costanza is at the calzone shop and he tips. Tipping means to ensure promptness, right? Whoops, sorry. Misspelling should be T-I, right? Not tech. But Seinfeld, they have yada, 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 econ.com. It's a great website for economics of Seinfeld. And what it is George Costanza is at a calzone shop, and the maker of the calzone, the baker, he looks away right as George drops the dollar in. So same thing, when I go to Starbucks, I want to make sure that they see that I'm tipping them. I'm not tipping them in pure benevolence. Like, I tip them, and the utility they get from seeing that I tip them, it's a mutual, it's kind of an exchange basically here, right? And so I know that I'll get better service and I enjoy the service, I get more utility from that. And in this case, George, he asked, George is unhappy because the person didn't say, oh, it's funny, you just watch the clip, but he didn't see him tip. And so later Jerry asked him, what, you don't tip blind people, right? And he's not change, right? So the idea that he'll tip blind people, but only if they know that he's tipping. And so that's kind of an example of utility. People get utility out of tipping people, often in knowing that the person who's being tipped knows that they tipped them, right? Donations, why do people give to the poor rather than buying something? Well, people do get a good feeling, utility out of knowing that they've made someone's life better, right? Helping someone across the street, going out of your way to do those things. Gifting, there's another Seinfeld, and I think it was Freakonomics did a thing on this, the wastefulness of gift giving, holidays. We should really just give each other cash, but that's not fun. And you don't really get as much utility. Try giving your wife cash for her birthday or for an anniversary gift. You're like, no, I want you to go out and maximize your utility with this money that I would have bought something that I think you want. So, but that doesn't go over very well, right? So there's an example on there. Risk aversion, I'll get into that. Marginal utility, why people are risk averse is because the utility they can get from let's say a $5 bet, losing the $5, the negative utility of that is much greater than the positive utility that it could get from having $5 more. That is, if you look at someone who's living on, let's say $1 a day, losing the dollar would be, catastrophic, but giving them $1 more a day is it's changing their day, but it's not nearly as impactful as taking the dollar away, right? So basically the difference, that's why we're risk averse. We can show that mathematically in a little bit. But I'll just, total utility, marginal utility, I won't get into this, but we'll get into this later, so I'll show the examples. I just want to give you an idea of what utility is. So I hope you enjoyed that, and know that more is to come.